Have you ever heard of a Hollywood star so tormented by the system, so disillusioned by fame, that she actually planned to murder the head of a major film studio and meant it? No, this isn't a script from a noir thriller. It's real. This is the story of Jean Arthur, a woman whose soft voice and endearing screen presence captivated millions, but whose off-screen reality was so dark and deeply repressed that it nearly led her to cross a line from frustration to violence. She wasn't some fringe actress lost in the shadows of Tinseltown. Jean Arthur was the leading lady of 1930s and 40s Hollywood, the trusted muse of director Frank Capra, the on-screen partner of Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart, Cary Grant. But behind that familiar, wholesome face was a storm no one saw coming. A storm that nearly consumed her and the man who tried to control her. So here's the uncomfortable question. What happens when a woman who doesn't fit Hollywood's mold, who refuses to play the game, becomes too big to be ignored, but too principled to be controlled? Welcome back to Tragedy Uncovered, the channel where we peel back the gloss of fame to reveal the truth, the raw, haunting, human stories behind the spotlight. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. This is not your usual celebrity gossip. We dive deep, we confront the uncomfortable, and we ask the questions most channels won't. Now, let's talk about Jean Arthur, the woman who once whispered about murder and meant every word. Born Gladys Georgiana Green in the early 1900s, and I say early because even that detail is debated, Jean was not like other aspiring starlets of the time. She wasn't dazzled by the lights of Hollywood. She didn't crave the stage. She wasn't ambitious in the way the studios liked: loud, accommodating, camera-ready. In fact, she hated interviews. She loathed red carpets. She despised the term cheesecake photo, those glamorous, flirtatious promo shots expected of all actresses. For Jean, the entire concept of selling yourself was degrading. And yet, somehow, she found herself front and center in an industry built on nothing but image. Her early life was already filled with contradictions. The youngest of 4 children and the only girl, she often described her brothers as for fathers, constantly telling her what to do, what to think, what to feel. That dynamic would shape her views on authority, particularly male authority, for the rest of her life. And perhaps it would also explain why she found herself constantly caught between submission and defiance. Jean didn't fall into acting because of dreams of stardom. She stumbled into it through modeling, almost reluctantly. A background prop at first, a hat model second, then finally a silent film extra. Her rise was quiet, even awkward, but directors noticed something about her, something unpolished, raw, emotionally honest. She wasn't acting. She was that naturalness, however, quickly became a liability in the age of big gestures and exaggerated drama. Critics found her dull. Studios thought she lacked charisma. One director called her a mechanical doll. She was fired, rejected, passed over, time and again. So she adapted. Jean didn't cry her way to success. She learned. She toughened up. She lowered her voice, quite literally hiring a coach to develop a huskier, more mature register, which later became one of her signature traits. She stopped being the girl from Plattsburgh, New York, and became Jean Arthur, a name she chose herself, pulled from the legends of Joan of Arc and King Arthur. But even as she molded herself into what Hollywood needed, she remained a misfit at heart, a principled one. And that's where the tension started to build. In an industry run by men powerful, unchecked, often ruthless, Jean Arthur didn't just clash with the system. She tried to fight it. And that put her directly in the path of Harry Cohn, the infamous head of Columbia Pictures. Now, for those unfamiliar, Cohn wasn't just a producer. He was a tyrant in a tailored suit. He controlled every aspect of his stars' lives. Their contracts, their public image, their personal time. And for a woman like Jean, who valued control over her own artistry, working under him was psychological warfare. Their relationship began like so many others in Hollywood, transactional. She delivered hit after hit. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. You Can't Take It With You. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. She became Columbia's golden goose. And Cohn, he cashed in while tightening the leash. Scripts she didn't want. Schedules she couldn't keep. Roles she loathed. Jean begged for space. Cohn gave her deadlines. She asked for quality. He handed her quantity. She pushed back. He pushed harder. Eventually, she sued him. You heard that right. Jean Arthur, in an era when actresses were expected to smile and obey, filed a lawsuit against one of the most powerful men in the business. She accused him of forcing her into degrading, meaningless roles, of violating her creative integrity, of using her like a machine. And she lost. Because of course she did. The courts, the press, the studios, they all sided with the kingmaker. But this wasn't just a legal defeat. It was emotional devastation. The moment that cracked whatever dam Jean had built inside herself to keep functioning in Hollywood. And it was then, as she recounted to close friends, that she seriously began to consider the unthinkable. Murder. Her friend, actor Roddy McDowell, later said, she wasn't joking. It wasn't some dramatic vent. She had a plan, and it was reasonable in her mind. Chillingly reasonable. Jean Arthur had reached her limit. So here we are looking at a woman who starred in some of the most beloved films of her generation, who worked with legends, and who nearly committed a crime that would have shaken Hollywood to its core. Not out of greed, not out of fame, but because she was trying to protect what little artistic soul she had left. The question is, what does that say about the system she was trapped in? And maybe more importantly, what does it say about us, the audience, who cheered for her on screen but never saw the storm raging off it? This was just the beginning. In the next segment, we'll dive into the relationships that defined and destroyed Jean Arthur's career, including her fraught friendship with Rita Hayworth, her rumored romance with Mary Martin, and her complicated love affair with anonymity. But first, if this story has caught your attention, if it's making you think differently about what fame really costs, take a moment to subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered. Because here, we don't just retell history, we re-examine it. See you in part 2. If the courtroom loss had cracked something inside Jean Arthur, what came next slowly tore the rest of it down piece by fragile piece. You'd think that after nearly breaking mentally and emotionally, Jean would have stepped back, taken time, maybe even disappeared. But in true Hollywood fashion, the industry didn't give her time to breathe. Within months, she was back on set, back under contract with Columbia, back under the thumb of the very man she once fantasized about killing. Harry Cohn, unaware of how close he'd come to becoming a real-life film noir victim, simply went back to business as usual. That's how much power he had. Jean, in the end, renegotiated her contract for a bit more control, a bit more breathing room. But she never forgot. The hatred remained. The exhaustion lingered. Yet here's the twist. Even in the middle of this emotional chaos, Jean Arthur delivered some of the most iconic performances in American cinema. In You Can't Take It With You, 1938, she was paired with a young, idealistic Jimmy Stewart. In a Capra film about love clashing with capitalism, their chemistry felt effortless. Stewart later said working with Jean was an unforgettable experience, and from a man who worked with everyone. That meant something. A year later, in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jean once again stood beside Stewart, portraying the savvy aide who guides his naive senator through political hell. It's not just her comic timing or emotional delivery that made her stand out, it's that you believed her. She wasn't acting. She was that woman. Tough, world-weary, principled, emotionally barricaded, but deeply empathetic underneath. You can almost sense Jean channeling herself into these roles. Her own cynicism, her private disappointments, her yearning for something more than scripts and makeup. Capra saw it too. He once said, "You didn't need to explain things to Jean. She just got it." He considered her one of the finest actresses he'd ever worked with, and if you look at Capra's track record, that's saying a lot. But as Jean's career soared, so did her unease. She kept moving forward, from one studio lot to another, but never comfortably. She couldn't stand the publicity machine. She refused interviews. She wouldn't pose for the cheesecake shots that helped so many others climb the ladder. In fact, when asked about it, she once said bluntly, "I'd rather have my throat slit." This wasn't diva behavior. It was self-protection. Unlike many of her peers, Jean didn't crave validation from gossip columns or studio parties. She wasn't trying to seduce the press or charm the public. She wanted her work to speak for itself. And it did. But in a business that demanded constant performance both on and off-screen, Jean's refusal to play the game made her an outsider, even as she stood at the very center of the industry. And then came Only Angels Have Wings, a film that pushed her limits in more ways than one. Starring opposite Cary Grant, Jean was thrust into the kind of gritty, masculine adventure story that demanded emotional tension and vulnerability, often shot out of order to maintain continuity. But director Howard Hawks did things differently. He shot in sequence, which disoriented Jean. She wasn't used to building her character arc scene by scene, day by day. It triggered her anxiety, her perfectionism, her old ghosts. And then there was Rita Hayworth. To put it plainly, Jean Arthur and Rita Hayworth could not stand each other. On set, they barely spoke. Off set, the tension was palpable, while Jean was quiet, introspective, and privately intense. Rita was rising fast, magnetic, sensual, the kind of studio-friendly starlet Jean despised. Their scenes together were electric on screen, but that electricity was very real behind the scenes, and not in a good way. Some say Jean was jealous. Others say Rita resented Jean's seniority. The truth? It was probably both. Two women with completely different approaches to their craft forced into the same frame, under the same male gaze, battling for control in a world that gave them very little. But perhaps the most controversial and most revealing relationship in Jean's life wasn't with a co-star or a director. It was with fellow actress Mary Martin. They met at a dinner party in 1939. The initial encounter was awkward. Jean reportedly spent most of the evening chatting with a story editor, barely acknowledging Mary. But something changed. They became friends. Close friends. Neighbors. Confidants. And soon, rumors began to swirl. The two women bore an uncanny resemblance. Same height, same cheekbones, similar voice tones. Hollywood being Hollywood. Speculation ran wild. Were they lovers? Were they more than friends? Jean never confirmed. Mary never denied. But their relationship remained close for decades. They shared an obsession with the character Peter Pan. Both would play the role on Broadway. And as the whispers grew louder, Jean retreated further into privacy. One friend recalled Jean saying that sex was something she could live without. Another described her as a romantic idealist, always chasing perfection, never quite finding peace. But what matters isn't whether Jean and Mary were romantically involved. What matters is why that question was treated like a scandal in the first place. Why two women choosing to live quietly next door to one another was considered headline-worthy. In one of her rare teaching moments, decades later, Jean chose to have her students perform a scene from The Children's Hour, a play about two women falsely accused of being lovers by a vindictive student. After the scene, Jean reportedly became visibly emotional, warning her class about how rumors, even false ones, can ruin lives. Was she talking about herself? We'll never know. But maybe we don't need to. Because Jean Arthur was never going to give us closure. She didn't believe in the public's right to know everything. In fact, she spent her entire career fighting that very idea. The expectation that celebrity meant access, that fame meant ownership. And for that, the industry punished her. By 1942, the Hollywood Women's Press Club named her the least cooperative actress in the business, a distinction that might have broken a lesser star. But for Jean, it was just confirmation that she was never meant to belong. The thing about people like Jean Arthur, people who bottle everything up, who smile through the pressure, who say, "I'm fine," until they aren't, is that when they break. It's never quiet. After a decade of playing America's sweetheart on-screen and Hollywood's problem child off it, Jean began to fray at the edges. Not in the tabloid sensationalized way we've come to associate with celebrity downfalls. There were no DUI arrests, no paparazzi chases, no messy scandals splashed across newspapers. No, Jean's unraveling was internal, invisible, the kind that doesn't explode, it corrodes. And it didn't happen overnight. By the early 1940s, Jean was still a box office draw, still under contract, still delivering sharp, memorable performances. The Devil and Miss Jones, 1941, was a hit. The Talk of the Town, 1942, co-starring Cary Grant and Ronald Colman, further solidified her reputation. She was still witty, warm, commanding. On the surface, nothing had changed. But behind that surface was a woman who could barely keep going. Her paychecks, ironically, hadn't caught up to her fame. For the Talk of the Town, Jean was paid only half of what her male co-stars received. This, in spite of the fact that she was carrying equal, if not greater, narrative weight. It was a quiet insult, one of many. The industry rarely said the quiet part out loud. Instead, it chipped away at actresses like Jean with smaller budgets, fewer choices, diminished autonomy, and constant reminders of who really ran the show. She'd reached a point where success no longer felt like a reward. It felt like a trap. And then came The More the Merrier, 1943. One of the finest comedic performances of her career. She played a sharp-tongued, no-nonsense government clerk in wartime Washington, a role written specifically for her by close friend Garson Kanin. The movie was smart, funny, and surprisingly progressive. Jean nailed it. She earned her first and only Oscar nomination for Best Actress. But here's the irony. That same film, the one that brought her critical acclaim, also pushed her closer to the edge. Because by now, the cost of playing these roles, of living in contradiction every day, had become unbearable. Jean wasn't just pretending to be exhausted, overworked, misunderstood. She was those things, and no amount of accolades could change that. Her personal life, too, was falling apart. Her marriage to Frank Ross Jr., a film producer and one of the few stabilizing figures in her life, began to crumble. On paper, they were a good match. In reality, Jean's emotional withdrawal and Ross's increasing involvement in politics and public life left them drifting apart. It's hard to sustain a marriage when one partner wants to vanish from the world and the other wants to navigate it. By 1944, something inside Jean finally snapped. She'd wrapped The Impatient Years, a film that felt like a metaphor for her own state of mind. She was done, not in a performative way, not in a temporary, taking a break kind of way. She was done with Hollywood, with studios, with lights, with scripts. She declared it publicly. I'm free. I'm free. It should have felt like liberation. But for Jean, freedom came with a heavy cost. She tried returning to theater, her first love. She played in a few productions, hoping the stage would restore something the cameras had taken. But it wasn't enough. The years of suppression had taken a toll on her health, not just mentally, but physically. The stress manifested in ways she didn't expect. Then came St. Joan, It was a dream role, one of her lifelong fascinations. Joan of Arc, the warrior saint, the misunderstood visionary burned for her beliefs. Jean had idolized her since childhood. Now, in her 50s, she was finally bringing her to life on stage. She should have been thrilled. Instead, it nearly destroyed her. The production was a mess from the start. Jean clashed with the director, Harold Clurman. Despite having contractual power to remove him, she didn't. She couldn't. Not because she lacked strength, but because she lacked the energy to fight anymore. They disagreed on the interpretation of Joan. Clurman pushed her to deliver a performance that felt alien to her instincts. And Jean, already brittle, began to collapse. During rehearsals in Delaware, Clurman criticized her harshly, nitpicking, undermining, questioning her artistic choices. Something in Jean snapped. In a moment of uncharacteristic fury, she grabbed him by the lapels and shouted, "You've ruined me." Think about that. Ruin me. Not ruin the play. Not ruin the character. But ruin me. By the time the production reached Chicago, Jean was physically breaking down. Her lymphatic system had begun to shut down, a stress-induced immune collapse. Her body had absorbed too many years of conflict, compromise, and quiet suffering. She was bloated, feverish, disoriented, and yet, the show demanded she keep going. The audience waited. The crew waited. The industry always waits and rarely listens. Eventually, she was hospitalized, diagnosed with what was then called a nervous breakdown. Today, we might call it something else. Burnout, complex trauma, PTSD from years of emotional labor. Whatever the label, the result was the same. Jean Arthur, the woman who had once carried entire films on her shoulders, could no longer stand upright. She recovered. Slowly, quietly. She told people not to feel sorry for her. She insisted she didn't regret her choices. But the Jean Arthur who emerged from that hospital was no longer chasing approval. She was no longer fighting for a seat at a table that never really welcomed her. She disappeared not in disgrace, not in tragedy, but in quiet refusal. Hollywood never held a funeral for her career. There was no dramatic send-off, no tribute, no grand farewell. And maybe that's exactly how she wanted it. But before she stepped fully into the shadows, Jean gave Hollywood one last performance. After the collapse, there was silence. Not just from Jean Arthur's voice, once beloved for its husky warmth and delicate musicality, but from her entire existence. The studios stopped calling. Or maybe she stopped answering. Either way, the woman who once dominated billboards and box offices quietly slipped through the cracks of the system that had nearly devoured her. But silence doesn't mean surrender. And in Jean Arthur's case, her disappearance wasn't failure. It was an act of defiance. Still, before she fully stepped away, she allowed herself one last return. One last film. One final time before the camera. And as with most things in her life, it wasn't random, it was meaningful, loaded with subtext. Chosen, perhaps, not for money or fame, but for how it mirrored her own story. The film was Shane, 1953. By the time Shane was made, Jean was in her early 50s, a time when most actresses of her generation had been discarded or typecast into unrecognizable shadows of their former selves. But this wasn't some desperate comeback. She wasn't trying to reclaim anything. In fact, many believe she accepted the role of Marion Starrett only because she knew it would be the last time. And what a role it was. Marion is a woman caught between two men, one who represents domesticity and duty, and another Shane who represents danger, freedom, and the unknown. She's strong, but tired, loving, but resigned, and through her eyes, we see a dying world, a world of old codes and buried truths. In other words, Jean Arthur, personified. Watching Shane now, decades removed, It's impossible not to see the parallels. Jean had always played women who were torn between what society expected and what they truly wanted, between rebellion and retreat. In Shane, she didn't just act that conflict. She lived it. Every line, every glance, every silent pause carried the weight of her off-screen battles. Critics praised her performance. Some called it her most grounded. Others said it lacked the sparkle of her earlier work, but maybe that's the point. She wasn't the same. She didn't want to be. She wasn't playing a starlet anymore. She was playing a woman on the edge of history and her own story. Shane became the highest-grossing film of her career, a financial success, a critical favorite. And yet, once the cameras stopped rolling, Jean vanished again. This time, for good. She didn't host farewell interviews. She didn't release memoirs. She didn't even attend awards shows honoring her past work. Instead, she returned to the East Coast, to a quiet life filled with books, animals, and eventually students. Yes, students. Because somewhere in her retreat from the industry, Jean discovered a new purpose: teaching. In the late 1960s, she began working with drama students at Vassar College, one of the most prestigious liberal arts schools in the country. It was an unexpected turn for someone who had spent her life avoiding attention. But perhaps it was exactly what she needed. Her students described her as intense but compassionate, a teacher who didn't give you easy answers, but instead demanded introspection. She taught them how to feel, not just perform, how to understand the emotional architecture of a character, and most importantly, how to protect their artistic boundaries. That last lesson, you suspect, came straight from her own scars. But as with most chapters in Jean Arthur's life, peace was never permanent. Even at Vassar, she found herself increasingly isolated. The faculty was conservative, restrained. Jean, by contrast, was restless, deeply emotional, often misunderstood. She confided in one rare interview that she was lonely there, that despite her gratitude, she couldn't truly connect. So she moved again, this time to the North Carolina School of the Arts, a place she hoped would offer more creativity, more freedom. She found some joy there, briefly, but it didn't last. The rhythm of collaboration was always a double-edged sword for Jean. She needed people, until she didn't. And when the solitude became too heavy, she'd dip back into public life for just a moment, a guest appearance here, a small event there. One of the most notable came in 1972, at the USA Film Festival in Dallas, where she reunited with her old friend and collaborator, Frank Capra. They were older now, quieter, but still connected by something unspoken, a creative understanding few others shared. At the festival, Capra joked that they should go on a road show together, screening his old films and talking to audiences. Jean smiled. For once, she didn't recoil from the suggestion, but it never happened, because nostalgia, while comforting, was never enough for her. That's the thing about Jean Arthur. She didn't believe in monuments. She didn't want to become a relic. She wasn't interested in being remembered as the way she used to be. For her, legacy wasn't about enshrining the past. It was about guarding the truth of who she was, even if that meant erasing herself from the spotlight altogether. And yet, the world wouldn't let her go completely. Stories about her began to re-emerge. Rumors, retrospectives, tribute screenings. Younger audiences discovered her films. Film scholars started to re-evaluate her impact, not just as an actress, but as a figure of quiet resistance. A woman who navigated Hollywood on her own terms, even if it nearly broke her. Then came the moment that summed it all up. In 1973, long after anyone thought she'd be in the news again, Jean Arthur made headlines for, of all things, trespassing. She'd entered a neighbor's property in North Carolina to rescue a dog. Yes, a dog. The police were called. She was arrested. But in court, Jean calmly explained that the dog had been neglected, that she couldn't just stand by. The judge let her go. The story made local papers, then national ones. Some found it amusing. Others saw it as another eccentric act from a reclusive former star. But those who truly understood her knew better. Jean Arthur had spent her entire life rescuing something: her characters, her integrity, her soul from a system that asked her to betray herself at every turn. Rescuing a dog was just another version of that same impulse. She couldn't save herself in Hollywood, but maybe she could save someone or something else. And that's the haunting beauty of her story. She didn't end her career with a standing ovation. She ended it with a whisper, a quiet protest, a closed door. By the time most stars reach their twilight years, they've either been forgotten or transformed into monuments of nostalgia, invited to accept lifetime achievement awards, wave from balconies at tribute festivals, or cameo in watered-down versions of the roles that made them famous. Jean Arthur wanted none of it. As the 1970s unfolded, Jean's distance from the industry didn't lessen. It deepened. She had no desire to reinvent herself, to perform as a softened version of her former self, or to play into the grand illusion that aging actresses were supposed to be grateful for any crumbs left on the casting table. In fact, she rejected the very premise. When asked at age 70 whether she would ever return to acting, her response was simple and sharp. If this were in England, and there were Margaret Rutherford roles to be had, that would be great. But here, if they want me, it's to play some beaten-down old woman in a Western. No thank you. She wasn't bitter. She was clear. Jean understood something most people in the industry still resist. In Hollywood, aging isn't just a biological process. It's a marketing liability, particularly for women. Especially for women like her, women who had once been symbols of wit, grace, and sensual restraint. Once those qualities were no longer considered bankable, the system didn't evolve to accommodate them. It simply turned away. But Jean didn't beg for a place in that narrative. She chose not to participate. And that choice, as unassuming as it seemed, was, in many ways, her most radical act. She received offers, of course, always filtered through the same outdated lens. Roles as mothers of outlaws, aging missionaries, worn-out widows with a heart of gold. Offers that reduced her to an age bracket, not a character. She turned them down flat. One producer even offered her a part in Lost Horizon, hoping her name would bring credibility to the film's spiritual undertones. She read the script. It's a deadly part, she said. And that was that. It wasn't that she saw aging as shameful, quite the opposite. Jean Arthur simply refused to let others define what that meant for her. She didn't wear her age as a costume. She didn't need permission to grow older on her own terms. And in doing so, she became a kind of quiet icon for a form of independence rarely seen in Hollywood. The woman who walks away and means it. Instead of red carpets, she preferred bookstores. Instead of retrospectives, she immersed herself in animal rescue work, not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but because it brought her peace. That same instinct, that same fierce protectiveness that had defined so many of her roles, now extended to the voiceless and the vulnerable. Dogs, cats, strays, lost things, things others discarded. And maybe, just maybe, she saw herself in them. There's something quietly haunting about someone who spends their whole life in front of a camera, only to choose deliberately to vanish from every lens. Jean didn't leave a trail of tell-alls or scandal memoirs. She didn't stage a comeback. She didn't even attend her own tribute events. In fact, when film festivals tried to honor her showcasing her work, inviting her to speak, offering awards, she almost always declined. Not because she was ungrateful, but because she believed her work had already spoken. She had said what she needed to say, not just through words, but through resistance. That resistance extended even to death. Jean Arthur passed away on June 19, 1991, at the age of 90. There was no funeral, no procession, no public farewell. Per her wishes, her body was cremated and her ashes scattered off the Pacific Ocean. It was fitting. She'd always preferred the open sky, the quiet wind, the things that couldn't be framed or staged. And yet, the world noticed. Obituaries poured in not from tabloids, but from voices that had finally begun to understand who she was. The Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, tributes from former co-stars, directors, critics who had watched her disappear and only now realized what they'd lost. One critic, Charles Champlin, wrote that to a generation of teenagers growing up in small towns, Jean Arthur wasn't just a movie star, she was the proof that spirit mattered as much as beauty, that integrity could be magnetic, that silence could speak louder than fame. It's hard to think of a more powerful epitaph, because Jean Arthur didn't want a legacy sculpted in bronze. She didn't want her name etched in stone, her face preserved in digital reels. She wanted something more fragile and, paradoxically, more lasting. She wanted her work to remain untethered to gossip, timeless in its sincerity, uncorrupted by spectacle. And somehow, she achieved that. Even as generations pass, even as newer audiences discover her through restored films and vintage clips, there's something unplaceable about her screen presence. A sense that she knows something, that she sees through the artifice, that she's letting you in, but only as much as she chooses. That's the paradox of Jean Arthur, warm, yet distant, effervescent, yet elusive. A performer who gave everything to her roles and almost nothing to her fame. In an era where visibility is often mistaken for value, her refusal to be seen became its own form of visibility. And in her final years, that visibility looked nothing like we're used to. No entourages, no magazine covers, no dramatic final interviews. Just a quiet home, some animals, some students, and the occasional friend who knew where to find her. By now, it should be clear, Jean Arthur didn't just walk away from Hollywood. She escaped it, not in a blaze of controversy or a dramatic fall from grace, but in the most un-Hollywood way imaginable, through silence, restraint, and an unwavering refusal to let the system dictate her value. And that's what makes her story so difficult to place, even now, because in an industry obsessed with comebacks, reinventions, and public redemption arcs, Jean Arthur wrote her ending with a closed door and never looked back. But what if that silence wasn't a retreat? What if it was a message? It's tempting to read her disappearance as tragedy. After all, here was a woman who, by all metrics, had it all: fame, respect, critical acclaim, financial stability. She had directors who revered her, co-stars who praised her, audiences who adored her. And yet, she left. So we ask, was she broken by the system? Or did she beat it? It's easy to paint her as a victim of misogyny, of studio power plays, of internal anxiety. And yes, those forces were very real. Jean Arthur was gaslit, underpaid, overworked, and publicly diminished more times than we'll ever know. She struggled to trust others. She battled severe stage fright well into the height of her career. She was often misunderstood by the press, by producers, even by her fans. But that's not the whole story. Because Jean Arthur wasn't passive. She wasn't just surviving Hollywood. She was actively resisting it. Quietly, relentlessly, strategically. She fought for better scripts. She rejected roles she didn't believe in. She sued her studio head at a time when doing so could end your career. She demanded creative control long before it became fashionable to do so. And when none of that worked, she simply opted out. That isn't weakness. That's clarity. clarity most actors never get or are too afraid to act on. And perhaps that's the uncomfortable truth buried beneath her legacy. Jean Arthur showed us that it's possible to be a major star and still say no, to be respected, admired, profitable, and still refuse to be molded into someone else's idea of success. But the cost is invisibility. Jean Arthur paid that price willingly. She gave us unforgettable films, performances filled with intelligence, restraint, and a kind of emotional honesty that feels almost alien in today's world of overexposure. She made us laugh without clowning, made us feel without pleading, made us care without demanding attention. And then, she disappeared. There's a strange kind of rebellion in that, especially today, in a culture addicted to constant visibility, where the mere act of being forgotten is seen as failure, where artists, especially women, are expected to remain relevant, marketable, brandable, until their final breath. Jean refused that narrative. She didn't just avoid the spotlight. She dismantled it. She proved that presence isn't always the measure of worth, that stepping away can be just as loud as staying, that sometimes the most honest thing you can do is vanish. But here's the paradox. For someone who tried so hard to disappear, Jean Arthur never really left us. She's in every woman who's ever demanded better treatment on set, in every actress who refuses to play the girlfriend, in every performer who asks for creative control, or challenges a contract, or says no to a publicity stunt that doesn't feel right. She's in the quiet rage of artists who know the system is rigged and choose integrity anyway. Even the modern industry, as self-congratulatory as it often is, still hasn't fully caught up with the road she tried to pave. Jean wasn't waiting for a movement to follow. She was the movement decades too early, isolated, and barely recognized. We still don't quite know what to do with someone like her. She doesn't fit into easy Hollywood archetypes. Not the tragic starlet, not the diva, not the comeback queen, not even the celebrated elder stateswoman of the screen. She refused all of those identities. She was just herself. And that's what makes her terrifying and thrilling to remember. Because in remembering her, we're forced to ask harder questions about fame itself. What if success doesn't look like staying until the lights go out? What if relevance isn't worth the compromises it demands? What if walking away not because you failed, but because you refuse to fail yourself is actually the most radical thing a person can do? Jean Arthur didn't die forgotten. She died intentionally unseen. No funeral, no memorial, no closing curtain call. Just the sound of ocean wind over the Pacific, the only audience she ever really trusted to hold her secrets. And maybe that's the point. Maybe her story isn't meant to end with applause. Maybe it's meant to linger like a question we're not quite ready to answer. So the next time someone tells you that disappearing means you've lost, think of Jean Arthur, the star who vanished and, in doing so, said everything she needed to say. So maybe the real mystery wasn't why Jean Arthur disappeared. Maybe the real mystery is why more people don't. Why more artists don't walk away when the applause turns hollow, when the scripts feel dishonest, when the spotlight starts to burn rather than illuminate. Maybe the question isn't why she chose silence, but why we demand noise from people who have already given us everything. Because what Jean Arthur left behind wasn't just a filmography. It was a warning, a whisper in a system that only listens to screams. A roadmap not to stardom, but to survival. And now, the burden of interpretation doesn't belong to her. It belongs to us. What does it say about a culture that only values those who stay visible? What does it mean when walking away is the only form of protest a woman can make without being punished? What do we lose when we demand permanence from people who were never meant to be monuments? There are no easy answers. But Jean never asked for answers. She asked for choice. And in the end, she made hers. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If Jean Arthur's story stirred something in you, a memory, a question, a realization, then don't let it fade. Subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered, where we continue to reveal the truths that history tried to bury and the people Hollywood tried to forget. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and never stop asking who gets remembered and why. Goodbye for now.